I'm going to talk a bit about the latest on SPFx on building extensibility for SharePoint, and I'm going to show a nice demo, something what we showed as part of the Las Vegas as well on the future of the SharePoint UX and what it also means for SPFx, because there's stuff evolving there as well. Now, this will not be super cool demo heavy. I'm going to just call out the extensibility points as we go through within the demos, but I do have a few slides which I wanted to go through as well. Typical set of slides, typical set of things. So SharePoint Framework is, from our perspective, the easiest way to build your enterprise solutions for Microsoft 365. It is a pro development storytelling, but it gives you the capabilities of packaging your code, submitting that code easily to anybody else or your customers or from one tenant to another, and you can deploy that. And that's because of the automatic hosting, which is happening behind the scenes. So really the core power of SharePoint Framework comes from the fact that you do not need to call anybody in your IT and say, I need to set up an Azure website. If you're in a smaller company, yeah, it might not be a problem. For enterprises, quite typically, it's a different organization which manages the Azure and one organization manages the Microsoft 365. So getting that additional configurations in place might be problematic. SharePoint Framework has also the automatic single sign-on. It is based on industry standard tooling, meaning a web stack development. A lot of our samples are based on a React, which is a good and a bad thing. And the reason why a lot of our samples are based on a React is that Microsoft itself implements the native SharePoint Online experiences using React and React components, and that gives us some level of benefits, potentially even on a page size level, and that's kind of giving us then Fluent controls and React controls, which people are using as well. Technically, you don't have to do React. You can do Angular, you can do Amber, you can do whatever you want within the development. And it provides the consistent dev experience across the Microsoft 365 as well, which is really cool. Now, a classic slide as well on the let's say historical things on how we are approaching things. So SharePoint Framework is a modern client-side development. It's a light web and mobile. It is adapting on both sides. It powers our own experiences, which is a really important thing for us as well. So SharePoint Framework is a safe bet because Microsoft builds its own experiences with SharePoint Framework as well. So rather than giving you an alternative way of doing development, which Microsoft does not use it by itself. It's also backward compatible in a level which is actually quite unseen before. So even though today you would have a tenant where you use SharePoint Framework version 1.0 back in 2017 to create the web part, it still works in the SharePoint Online. There's some awesome magical things happening behind the scenes as you're building or using the web part. We actually do a runtime magical things to always use the latest version of SharePoint Framework. But for you as a developer, you don't need to worry about things. Or you as a customer or an enterprise who've been deploying this, you do not need to worry about what happens within your tenant. It is backward compatible from that perspective. SharePoint Framework supports open source tooling and JavaScript web frameworks as needed, and it's a pro development tooling for partners and customers. Now, we've been showing this following picture quite a few times with SharePoint Framework. It is extended from only from SharePoint to a numerous other areas as well. So originally first for Microsoft Teams, then Microsoft Viva, and the latest extension is Outlook and Microsoft 365 app, as the Microsoft Teams apps are also extended to be available in Outlook and Microsoft 365 app. Using the SharePoint Framework, you can just easily access the context where you are, so you can double check, am I in SharePoint, am I in Viva, am I in Outlook? Oh, then I behave a bit differently, or I will render myself differently. And the bullet points on the lower level we actually went through already: single sign-on, automatic code hosting, and industry standard tooling. Now, if you're wondering that is SharePoint Framework still a thing? Are people building intranets and experiences? And answer is yes, they are. They're building a lot of intranets and taking SharePoint Framework-powered extensibility into a use. It is growing in a really consistent way, and there are certain bumps. There are a few data hiccups there, and then there are typical bumps related on the holiday season in the Northern Hemisphere, which is always visible within the adoption. I cannot say how widely it's being used, but I can say that it's been used by tens of millions of monthly active users for the customer part. So, of course, anything in SharePoint Online which is modern is actually built using SharePoint Framework. So technically there's hundreds of millions of monthly active users for SharePoint Framework, but for the custom pieces implemented by customers and partners, there are tens of millions of those users who are using them within SharePoint Online. Today, we wanted to actually focus a bit more on coming back on the basics, so to say, not just talk about SharePoint Framework in Teams or not just talk about SharePoint Framework in Viva. Let's go back in basics. So what are the scenarios which are supported in SharePoint? And this comes back on maybe after the demo even more precisely, because we're going to talk about a bit about the future of SharePoint as well, which is having really interesting let's say, future steps related on the graphical interface and options and branding, as we're going to see within upcoming video as well. Now, in SharePoint, you can build cards. So you can basically surface those same cards in a dashboard web part in SharePoint, which we are building for Microsoft Viva. We can, of course, build web parts. That's the basic thing, basic kind of an object within a SharePoint framework. We can build extensions, and these are basically extending the list components or library components, or they're adding placeholders within the UX layer within the pages, a great option as well. And we can do app pages, and we can do, well, actually, technically, we would be able to say even more in here because we have the list formatting and all of list overriding options and all of those, but we're going to show those in a second as well. So a lot of options to build custom experiences, engaging experiences for customers, and of course, all of these options could be in store as well, which is really, really cool. Now, for the web parts, we're not going to deep dive again on the how the web part actually works. There's no point for that, but these are really good examples of building a web part. So web part by default has a access on the user information. It has access on the user token. It can act on behalf of the user. It is actually it's a JavaScript component which is being rendered in the UX, and then it can do things like accessing information in Microsoft Graph or in APIs, and then surfacing that information within a pages. So you can build really different kind of scenarios and options using that experiences. Of course, out of the box, there's a lot of features, but quite often customers are willing to say that, well, I want to have that feature, but I still want to adjust that to be a different else there, and that's an extensibility option for sure. Or if you want to build something like a dashboard, a BI dashboard for customers, surfacing relevant information from backend, that could be an easily a SharePoint Framework web part as well. Now, we talked about the extension options, and there are technically 5 different main extension options in SharePoint Framework for SharePoint, which are all GA'd. GA'd meaning that they're production ready. We have the application customizers, which are basically giving you the options to inject components in the UX layer of SharePoint. So basically in the header and footer. I'm going to do a pretty ugly demo on that one today, but there's a nice picture right now showing, like, for example, a global navigation which is embedded on the sides, or a footer which is followed on the side as well. Command set extension is mainly for adding extensions in the menus. So, for example, in the context menu of a file or a document library or a list, you can add buttons there and execute code whenever actually that button is being clicked. So the main difference here, comparing, for example, for list formatting, is that list formatting is JSON. You cannot execute code. With SharePoint Framework, you can execute code. You can open up a panel, you can open up an item, you can connect to your backend in Azure, you can connect even to your on-premises using Azure connectivity as completely seamlessly. So there's a lot of options to integrate from a library management perspective or list management perspective. Field customizers gives you the option of overriding the field presentation value. Unfortunately, for now, it's only for presentation value, not for the editing controls. But you can basically do a custom rendering of the field information, what you can see on the list. Form customizer is overriding the actual form of a list item, so you can override design whatever kind of experiences using pro-code development tooling in TypeScript and React on creating those forms as you want. Of course, you can use Power Apps. You can still use alternative other options as well, but SharePoint Framework is certainly an option to provide a pro development experience for overriding these things as well. And then search query modifier is a one relatively actually recent. It went GA in 1.16, which is a search query parameter modification on runtime when search query is performed in a site level. Not necessarily a widely used thing, but it's a good example of an extension which is based on a customer business requirement, and then it was provided to be available. There's good comments on the question on the chat, just making sure that those are being covered. GA basically means generally available, production ready, and that means that you can actually use it in production, so safely. Now, from a demo perspective, let's have a look on some of this stuff in our tenants. So I'm going to use two different demo tenants. And this is just for showcasing the different web parts behavior. And of course, you can combine the web parts any way you want. So for example, in this case, we have a nice looking example layout for recruitment site created actually based on one of the templates which are available. So I just applied a site template from the site templates, and that actually adds some of the out-of-the-box web parts on this page and out-of-the-box capabilities, and we can easily then change the behavior of the sites. Now with the web parts, we can of course then modify what are the pieces, we can modify the layouts and all of that stuff, but specifically for web part development, let me actually go back on the sample page. Let me actually create a page from here. And we can create a new blank page, and of course in the blank page we can then see the out-of-the-box web parts together with the custom web parts as well. So there's out-of-the-box web parts available, and then there's custom web parts. In this case, not too many web parts, but still those are available. One of the latest features in the web part side is that we're able to use also in a custom layouts. We're able to use this top navigation, top menu items. And what it means is that we're trying to simplify the end user behavior. So this is a really good example. This is an out-of-the-box web part, but just as well, you can take advantage of these things within your custom web part. So if your web part has multiple layout options, we can show them as a quick, easy drop down directly within the menu item, rather than making it too complicated to open up a property pane and then selecting from there and adjusting things. The settings are exactly the same, but it basically simplifies the options from an end user perspective and to provide them directly in the top menu rather than forcing always the property pane to get open. So having those key options available and exposed in here. Now, in our case, we of course can do the web parts themselves are super flexible. So the web part can actually be used in the multiple different ways. They can be used as a individual web parts. They can be used as a full page web part. They can be used as a full screen web part, or just a typical web part on a page, and they adapt directly on the layout. So depending again on the size of the layout, we can do different kind of implementations. Now, partly dependent, obviously, how the web part is being implemented, how it adapts. But by default, all of the web parts are responsive. And that is a great thing, because you can access the information then using any device, you want to use. Of course, to be fair, it's still true that if you go back on the Viva scenarios and Microsoft Viva connection dashboard, let me actually open up an example in here. These are much more fine-tuned for the mobile rendering. So as an example in here, we can see the dashboard. In this case, it's pretty big because I have a pretty high resolution. But now we can see that it makes more sense in a mobile to have a more dashboard-driven design than actually the layouts or squeezed the web part in this case. Again, depending on a customer case, depending on deployment. Now, what else can we do with SharePoint Framework in SharePoint? Of course, we can do things like placeholders. So this is the typical ugly placeholder. In my case, I enabled one central extension to be available within all of the sites within the tenant. So we can do header sections. Typically, that would be something like mega menu or a placeholder or notifications like the factory has an alert or whatever is the customer case. Or we could do menu down here. In this case, we can actually see two different extensions getting stacked, and that was intentional as well. So they do stack in, so you can include multiple extensions in the page if needed. Does it make sense? Debatable. Maybe it makes sense in this case only to have a one footer and not the second on top of that. And of course, the footer is over floating on the page, and if I go to site contents, it's actually still there as well. So it's kind of making sure that the placeholders are always visible regardless where you are on a page. What's really cool about these extensions, and this is the application customizer extension, is that you can control them in a tenant level. And what we mean with that one is that you do not need to deploy this application or this footer or even the web parts in a specific site level, which might have been the requirement in the past for SharePoint add-ins and all of that stuff. We have this really cool tenant-wide extension list, which is available in the app catalog. There's more documentation, obviously, in our docs on how this works. And I can control what are the extensions which are available and visible within my tenant. And what I mean with that one is that, for example, if we edit this one, that's actually the hello world message. I can say that this is now disabled. And just in case, let's actually disable that one as well. And then we stop editing. There we go. Those are now disabled and disabled. The global footer is enabled, and the global footer, let's actually modify that a bit if we don't run out of time. Let me actually do here. Can we do? It's pretty ugly. There's a spacing, but can we do? Where do we actually have something? Some text which we could change. Contours are sharing is caring. Let's add a explanation mark actually there. Oop, not the whole thing. Undo. No, no, no. Now I'm breaking it. No. Let me do this. Demo effect. There we go. There we go. So we can modify these extensions as any way we want, as we from the centralized location. An idea here is that if you want to have a centralized definition, that's a pretty ugly definition. Centralized control, for example, for the footer. Or, for example, you want to make sure that every single document library within this tenant would have a certain button, or it would have a certain context menu in them. You can do that from one centralized location. You don't have to deploy the solution to every single site. You deploy that to a tenant, and it will be available across the whole functionality. Now, in my case, I disabled those header and footer. We can see that those are now gone. And do we actually still get? Where's our footer? Did I broke the footer? I broke the footer. At least we got rid of the ugly extensions. They're no longer visible within a page. Now, the application of those settings from the tenant-wide extension might take a few minutes every now and then, and that seems that could be the reason why it's actually broken. That got to be pretty ugly. Anyway, let's not worry about that too much. Now, that's a quick kind of a recapping on the extensibility points. Again, we can do overriding of the new menus for lists and libraries. We can do the menu items. There's many options how we can extend the functionality and get them available, for example, in document libraries. Now, what I wanted to also show is that in the Las Vegas, within a few weeks back, it's not too far from the Microsoft 365 conference, we did announce that we're actually working on a new UX version of SharePoint Online. And I'm going to show the video first, and then I'm going to talk about and call out things. The video does not have sound, but I think the frame rate should be good enough for seeing the different options, what we're looking into making possible in the future within SharePoint. I'm going to talk about things, but you can see that the graphical elements, what we're seeing here, are not exactly the same, or the flexibility is not exactly the same as we can do right now in SharePoint. So this is a new UX version of the SharePoint, which is getting currently worked on. So a lot of new options, a lot of new layouts, a lot of new, more engaging UX, more options, more graphical elements, and all of that stuff. So again, we are kind of modernizing the SharePoint UX, even though currently I think we still call it a modern UI. currently, so is this then modern? But the idea here is that we want to make sure that the SharePoint UX is flexible enough for customer branding elements. So we're introducing a SharePoint brand center with the custom font support. We're introducing a lot of additional capabilities, and there will be more announcements coming up in autumn. So within the next semester, Ignite will be obviously a big conference where we will be showing some of this stuff live as well. Now, the cool thing about the reason why I wanted to show this is that the cool thing is we're not introducing a new development story. We will be using an evolving SharePoint framework, and all of the SharePoint framework components which you have implemented already will be working within this new UX and the new experiences as well. So rather than introducing again a new model, we want to have a backward compatible layout and backward compatible options. Whatever your investments are, you can actually take advantage of them in the future as well. And that's really the core mental mindset from SharePoint Framework from a day one. So we want to make sure that whatever code you have may be implemented in SharePoint, you can actually extend that to be available and exposed also in Teams or in Outlook and Microsoft 365, rather than forcing you to rewrite any of the extensibility.